And that's a real downer on the class spirit. That kind of downloading. But, you know, I got to speed up, you guys. I got to go faster. I apologize for that. You know, we've got a lot. I just figured out we've got about 4 sessions or so left, 4 or 5 sessions at the most, and not including the final exam. I mean, and I gotta get through a lot of people. So I'm gonna keep going. Let's look at alkali if we can. Yeah, I think this is a really good collection. This guy who did this collection died recently. He was a Reform rabbi, and or maybe he was a conservative rabbi, probably conservative rabbi. And I didn't like his political views. He's what we would call a cultural Zionist. He didn't want an independent state. He just wanted a cultural center in Palestine. So I really don't have much truck with him on his attitude towards. We'll get to the cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism will be represented by a Hada. And of all people that everyone thinks helped start the Jewish state, Chaim Weizmann. These are cultural Zionists. These are not Herzl political Zionists. Herzl's people are called political Zionists. You'll understand why political Zionism wanted a territorial entity that would be where sovereignty would be exercised. Cultural Zionism just wanted a cultural center of some kind under a foreign sovereignty. Yehuda Alkali was born in 1798 in Sarajevo, so he's from Yugoslavia and it would be Sephardi background, therefore. And his name is pretty Sephardi. He wrote a booklet in 1834 called Hero Israel, where he proposed the same thing as Kalischer, Jewish colonies in the Holy Land by a man's own effort in the preamble to redemption. This young lady's asked about redemption. I can't explain what redemption is. We don't have a theology in Judaism the way you have it in Christianity. And redemption means what the prophets are talking about. I read the prophets and see what they're talking about, and that's what they consider redemption to be. So if you can make sense of the prophets, you will understand it. Other than that, redemption does include ingathering of the exiles. And that's talked about in Isaiah, Ezekiel in particular. 2 of the greatest prophets. I think that Isaiah and Ezekiel are, I don't much like Jeremiah myself, but Isaiah and Ezekiel are like stupendous works of literature, probably above and beyond about most works of literature you'll find in most cultural expression. And I think for that reason, maybe their culture, the civilization represented, is justly well known. In any case, 1840 was a turning point in his life. This is a really important year. This is on page 103. There was actually a blood libel made in Damascus, and it swept the Jewish world because communications were strong enough at that time. I guess the telegraph was already operating. That people would have heard of it. Normally, back in the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have heard of it. Blood libel is, you know, a accusation that the Jews are slaughtering a non-Jewish child in order to bake matzahs. I mean, you know, it's so ridiculous that it's beyond comprehension. But this was going on in the Middle Ages all the time. Whenever that a non-Jewish Christian child or whatever, here it's a Muslim, would be seen near the Jewish ghetto, that maybe some rapist had dropped him off there, or some child molester or predator or whatever, then if it was around Easter or Passover time or something, then the superstitious crowd would be, you know, worked up into, this was, the Jews were baking their holy bread with Christian blood again, or other things with the desecration of the host, where the Jews were accused of sneaking into churches and sticking pins into the host because the doctrine of transubstantiation of Christ had just been introduced in those days, and Jesus' actual flesh, according to this papal doctrine. I don't know how many Protestant groups believe in this. Depends how close to Roman Catholicism or distant they become. But that the host was the actual body of Jesus. So if the Jews could sneak into the churches and stick pins into it, they could torture Jesus again in the minds of the crowd. That's called the desecration of the host libel. And why, you'd have to be pretty ignorant to think anyone was doing that. But in any case, the demonology is a very powerful thing. So this suddenly surfaced after people thought it was it had disappeared. And it had an effect on Moses Hess, apparently, to return to Judaism, as we'll see. And so he writes this in 1843, 3 years later. Again, just like Kalischer was writing a little later, but also he wrote earlier, Kalischer. His pleading is addressed to Jewish financiers, Jewish notables in the West. One in England, the most famous one, is Moses Montefiore. Again, that is a Sephardi name. The Jews in England were originally Sephardis, and others, to buy land from the Turks, just using biblical models as Abraham had done from the Hittites. And he also went to different European capitals to try to inspire this kind of practical work. And Herzl's grandfather had read Alkali, and as he says here, he was one of his admirers and disciples. So Herzl doesn't appear in a vacuum. When your grandfather is interested in someone, often you ultimately find that of interest to you. So it's just that Herzl had more ability to be a practical person for how to educate in the secular European world. So he could function in the secular European world where these people were still fairly religious. And he says, pardon me, not Herzl, but one of Alkali's descendants says, I thought about my grandfather, he's called a rabbi or still, Yehuda I Alkali. Hai means to live, who spent his life preaching the return to the land, and I remembered my grandmother, his wife, who in joyous dedication had sold her jewels to enable my grandfather to publish his books in which he broadcast his ideas about the return to the land of Israel. So you see, this is already stirring in the early 1800s, and of course this fright of the blood libel in Damascus in 1840, and you could look into that further if you're interested. Sure, you could Google it up and find it in Wikipedia or someplace. That's what everyone gets information from these days. I don't think you need to go to libraries anymore. It's all in the, pretty soon the whole library is going to be in the computer anyway, so we just chuck the building away, ultimately, I guess. That's why the libraries in people places don't want to reduce their stock to Google. Big struggle going on. Google wants to, copy everything in these big libraries. They want to charge Google because they're afraid that if Google does this, they'll go out of business, which they will. And but anyway. The third redemption. So this is earlier because it's in this collection, because it's written earlier than Kalischer's work. But Kalischer had an early work at this time. And of course, the next one we're going to read is Rome and Jerusalem, which is a very substantial work by Moses Hess. And that's 1845. So a lot of this is going on, I think it's 1845, isn't it? Let's see. No, it's 1862. I'm wrong. I apologize. Okay, 1862. The year after Kalischer. He's basically following chronology here in the selections he gives in this book. It's written in the Bible, and you're interested in redemption. Return the Lord and the tens and thousands of the families of Israel. Etc., etc. So yet we pray every day. Let our eyes behold thy return on mercy unto Zion. So this is the prayer for the return to Zion that the Reform are throwing out. She's asking me, how come Reform don't agree with these things? Are you kidding me? We just found out why the Reform don't agree with these things. They chucked it all out of the prayer books. Why did they chuck it out of the prayer books? That's the whole point of what we just studied. because they they wanted to look like they were good Germans, Frenchmen, Americans. They didn't want people to question their citizenship or their belonging to the new national entities they wanted to be part of. And anyone who was praying for return to Zion, we don't want to go back to Zion. When the First World War comes and Eisenman gets the Balfour Declaration from the British, which is addressed, of course, to Lord Rothschild, again, as a prominent, wealthy representative of the Jewish people. The anti-Zionists among the Jews in England protest. They don't want the Balfour Declaration. They don't want His Majesty's government to look with favor on the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine. They think that'll undermine their claim to British citizenship. The British will say, okay, well, you Jews out, go to Palestine. We don't want you here. So that's what they're worried about. Sure, I mean, there's a huge struggle going on here between the assimilationists and the others. But he's giving the prayer. See, we didn't have anyone actually. Here is the prayer. On whom should such a divine presence rest, he says? On stones, on nothing, on sticks. There's nothing there. So the redemption of our souls, which is supposed to be in some sense involved in this, that's what they believe. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, that's their belief. You know, we must have a number of people to go back. And he quotes biblical passages over and over and again because he's a rabbinic person and he's a Sephardi. Very much attached, you see, to the Bible. He's not affected by these, you know, reform movements, historical schools, all this other stuff, just pure Orthodox Judaism. We are therefore commanded not to attempt to go at once and all together to the Holy Land. That's what Herzl is going to say. You know, we can't all go at once. There's no sustenance there. We must remain in the dispersion so that they can help the first settlers go. And that's what Herzl, this is all what you'll find in the Jewish State by Herzl, written in 1896. So I guess, well, I guess it's 60 years later. See, there are two kinds, if you like, redemption or return. The return is basically considered by these religious people synonymous with the redemption. Individual and collective. Individual return means each man, like the Muslims say, jihad means you should fight for your, you know, soul to be more righteous. But that's not what jihad really means to the Muslim community. That's really papering it over. Jihad means holy war against non-Muslims. Everybody knows that. So anyway, he's saying that there's an individual redemption and there's a collective. I don't believe, I think he's being kind there. I don't think he really believes that. But anyway, that's what he's saying. Collective return means, I don't think most Jews think return means, you know, go to, you know, repentance, remission of sins, John the Baptist, and so on. Collective means that all Israel should return to the land, which is the inheritance of our fathers. Here you go. It gives you the answer you were asking me. To receive the divine command, except that's what we're reading this from. So you can see what that means. The yoke of heaven. The collective return was foretold by all the prophets, even though we were unworthy. And that's true. Ezekiel says, I'm not doing this for your sake. I'm doing it, Ezekiel 37, 38, some of those glorious passages ever written by any poetic prophet. I'm doing this for the sake of my great name, so the nations will know that I am, you know, so on and so forth. I personally love those passages in Ezekiel. I think they're marvelous. It's not for your sake that I'm doing this. You know, I know you're unworthy. No, that's not why I'm doing this. I want the nations to know, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I keep my promises and so on and so forth. That's what he's reflecting here. See, he's thinking that all from Ezekiel. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are like that too. In the Damascus document, you see there is a form of grace. Pauline grace, you know. Paul speaking about grace, you know. I forget how he puts it, but it's not that you deserve this, but grace and so on. Well, in the Damascus document, it say, because of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the ancestors, my promises to them. You're not worthy. I'm going to do these things for you, and so on. You just have to read. I can't get the passages now out of my mind quickly, but it's all in there in that Damascus document. The same ideas. These divisions, this is speaking about the redemption here, whatever that means to me. They've allowed the Holy Tongue to be forgotten. People don't know Hebrew anymore. They don't speak Hebrew, they don't write it, they don't understand it. Only the rabbis know it a bit because they study it their whole lives, and the average Jew knows nothing. Well, the average Jew knows he can pray and do things like that, but he can't really do a lot in the Hebrew language. But this cannot be accomplished by a miracle, a problem of this kind. And then he keeps quoting the Bible here. So this is very biblical, even more than any westernized Jewish person. You see how different the Sephardics are. They're all biblically oriented, which is really interesting. The redemption will begin with efforts by the Jews themselves. They must organize, unite, choose leaders, leave the lands, and since no community can exist without a governing body, we will have to appoint elders and so on and so forth. This is where they got, you see, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion from. That whole plot idea that the Russian secret police figured out. Oh, okay, the Jews are plotting to return to Zion or something like that. So they're really, plotting against the whole world and so on and so forth and so on. And all these guys are saying, hey, we need an organization to affect this. People can't just go on their own in any great numbers, They're talking about an organization to affect their exodus. They're getting out of this mess in Europe. And the Russians, secret police figured, since a lot of Jews are socialists and against the Tsar, we'll just turn it all around and we'll fix them good. And so they did. So they did, and it's still happening. Is what is meant by the promise to us of the anyway. These elders should be chosen by our greatest magnates, our financiers, the organization of an international Jewish body. That's what Herzl does. He creates what's called the Jewish Agency, which is the body that will be in charge of affecting the leaving. Well, you see, the Jews are much better organized, if you like, than the Arabs in this regard, and so of course the Arabs feel badly done by because the organization of the Jews, is constantly being pointed up to them when you see all their selfish behavior patterns with oil being used for prospering one country and not relieving the poverty of another. I mean, I just saw something about Libya. Someone visited Libya with huge amounts of oil revenues. The roads aren't even fixed there. There's garbage everywhere. There's huge amounts of poor people. Okay, Dubai and countries like that are upgrading the whole population, but a lot of these countries don't even do that. The Iranians, all they're doing with their money is buying weaponry. They're not alleviating anything except buying weaponry and encouraging, issues everywhere else, which is a serious matter. So, people envy other people who try to get things together and are to some extent effective. I don't think that all Jews were involved in this by any means, but Herzl did bring into being this Jewish agency, is what it was called. And Hitler used to go to Zionist meetings in Vienna. He used to attend and listen to the lectures there when he was an art student in Vienna. He knew what was what he was working with and exploiting. I don't think the Jews understood that this was going to have the effect that it had on some of these twisted people. It is not impossible for us to carry out the commandment to return to the Holy Land. The Sultan will not object. You see, this is a Sephardi Jew who knows the Sultan because he knows the Ottoman Empire. Yugoslavia was under the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan will not object, for His Majesty knows that Jews are his loyal subjects. You see, he has no regard for the Sultan because he's living in the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans were still part of the Ottoman Empire. Difference of religion should not be an obstacle for each nation. We'll worship its own God, and we will forever obey the Lord our God. I ask of our brethren, they organize a company. There's the Herzl approach. And this is, how many years before Herzl? 60 years before Herzl. On the mode of the fire insurance companies or the railroad companies. Let these companies, or like the Suez Canal Company, let these companies appeal to the Sultan to give us back the land of our ancestors in return for some rent. Once the name of Israel is again applied to our land, it even has the name of the country. Now, all Jews will be inspired to help this company with all its means at its disposal. Through this venture, we will begin modestly, but its future will be very great. If these people have been listened to in any way, I'm sure the Holocaust would have been totally avoided, because the Jews would have been mostly out of there. And all this problem that we're now seeing too in the Middle East would have been avoided for them too, because they would have basically come to an empty area. Sure, there would have been problems, but they would have been so powerful and so many of them that it wouldn't have even been a question. The point is that these people were not the majority of Jews writing like this. These were just advanced thinkers. You saw the majority, the people you're talking about, you know, the Reformed Jews and so on, you see what where their mind is. This kind of thinking would frighten them to death. Well, I have the benefit of hindsight. Okay, let's look at Hess. I think that's enough for. But the important thing about alkali is it's exactly the Herzl program 50, 60 years before. But of course, nothing's being done with it. Just a few people of that mindset. But you know, people are talking like that. Okay, Hess is an interesting case. 1812 to 1871. I hope you guys have this book. You'll find it. This is what we're going to use for the rest of the term, and it's really a good book. So he was, as he says, he was the same generation of Heinrich Heine. It's interesting. I was just reading this Wagner piece in another of these collections. I can't do too many excerpts for you guys from documents, but I like the documents. I think that's the most interesting. And, yeah, he's saying in this piece, Mendelssohn, he's going on about Mendelssohn because he knows Wagner stole most of his musical ideas from Mendelssohn. And he acknowledges that Mendelssohn is a great musician, but this essay doesn't make it clear what his problem with Mendelssohn is, except his Jewish blood. That's part of the problem, although Mendelssohn had converted to Christianity. And the only other, he says, the Jews have no poetic spirit, Wagner says. Not like us Germans. And, you know, the only poet they produced is Heinrich Heine. You know, the only German poet that they produced is Heinrich. And he was considered a very high poet. But this essay didn't go deep enough that I could figure out what Wagner's beef with Heinrich Heine was. But, you know, he was considered one of the greatest German lyrical poets. It's very interesting to read about Heinrich Heine, because his family is so typically German-Jewish family, and I'm familiar with that because my mother's side of the family is from that background. And I should tell you that on my father's side, you know, that was what made a difference to me personally. I went to Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, back in the late 50s, early 60s. When I was knocking around the world as a kind of I don't call myself a beatnik because I never believed what the beatniks believed. I had a tremendous, I knew them in Paris and met them in Israel and met them in India and really had a real, you know, like polar opposites repel each other, really had a strong repulsion to these people. I didn't like their drug ethic, I didn't like their sexual ethic, the way they were. Most of them had criminal backgrounds. A lot of the poets were ex-cons and things. And we in Paris, we saw ourselves as bohemians. You know, something before beatniks. The whole beatnik thing was really something that the things that they were announcing were, for us, most of us, rather repulsive and repugnant. But they had better PR and they took over everything in terms of the intellectual currents in this country. But what I was trying to say is I was knocking around in that period with those, when those people were around too. I was kind of on the road too. But I was on the road to the Middle East and to India and places like that. You know, I hitchhiked across America in 5 days and 5 nights back in 1959 or 60. And in those days you could do it, you know, it was frightening, I can tell you that, to do it, but you could do it without getting your throat slit. You could get maybe beat up or something like that. But then I hitchhiked all through Europe and different places. And I was one of the first persons I know that was walking around with a backpack in Europe back in the 1958, 59, 60, and so on. There was nobody with a backpack then. I bought a backpack up in American what do you call it, surplus, war surplus up in a market in Glasgow, Scotland, outside the train station. You know, some old American Army backpack. I used it all through all my travels. Of course, it was easier to go to a town and have a backpack, and you had your hands free. You could walk to find some cheap lodging or something like that. In any event, I went to Israel in 1960 after I ran out of money in Paris, knocking around the left bank in Paris and so on, sitting in the cafes where I met my future wife and so on. I didn't know I had family in Israel. And before I went there, my father suddenly appeared out of the blue. Said, "Oh, we've just come back." He was traveling, you know, he wasn't very wealthy, but he was trying to show that he was a big shot and stuff like that. And he was traveling around the world with the jet plane and stuff like that. Had just come into the process, so he got a tour around the world. He could land in Tokyo and Hong Kong, and he stopped in Jerusalem. And then suddenly he admitted that in the 20s, his family from Jerusalem had come to America, but he never told my mother's people about it, because my mother's people were German, Jewish, Reform sort of people, and they didn't, wouldn't think anything of that. They would look down on that sort of thing. So he'd had this from us. He never mentioned it my whole youth. Only when I was like 22, 23, he told me, that I had family in Jerusalem. So when I went to Jerusalem, I was going anyway. I was going to work on it, so he told me. And I met him in England or someplace. He was just coming back, and I was on my way. And I went there. I went through Turkey and took a train through Yugoslavia for $20. Got a boat in Istanbul for $45, 6 days and 6 nights on a boat to Haifa, and staying in youth hostels in Istanbul and stuff like that. There were ways of getting tickets, like you could buy the tickets in the Belgrade railroad station. If you changed your Belgrade, it was in the behind the Iron Curtain. And if you changed your money in Vienna, you could get, a huge rate. So you could buy a ticket all the way to Istanbul for like $15 from Belgrade or something like that. I went all the way to India for $40 and stuff like that. $10 across Turkey, $10 across Iran, $10 across Pakistan, and $10 for the boat to Bombay from Karachi. Nothing on the deck of a boat and stuff like that. So these things were what I did. But on the way, I went and worked on kibbutzim, and they weren't doing that. And I met my family in Jerusalem, and lo and behold, they told me that my great-grandfather had come and settled in Jerusalem at the time of the Turks. I said, well, what? I mean, I had no idea. No one ever told me anything. What had happened in my family, and I'm telling you this because I don't usually tell people in this university these things, or in this class, because it sort of shows a predisposition to have a certain point of view. But I don't care anymore, I'm retiring. But so you guys should know it if you want to know. It's useful. But it relates to our subject here. I said, you have a great-grandfather. He's buried on the Mount of Olives. I said, oh, really? Are you kidding? And then they trucked out his picture. And they showed me his picture. Hey, where's your picture of your great-grandfather? I said, whoa, how did he get here? Well, it turned out that they left Russia in the 1890s, just in the period we're talking about, of some of these groups that were in Tzadakah, Jerusalem sort of thing. He would be a Tzadakah Jew, not an agricultural Zionist Jew. And, what the Arabs would call a curly with a big beard and the whole thing, But in any case, he had 4 boys. And in Istanbul, they split up. And the 2 oldest ones came to America, which was my father's father and his younger brother, who was very successful. And you saw that movie Newsies. He was in the newspaper delivery business with a guy called Sarnoff, who later founded NBC, and they were very successful. So they all looked up to this younger brother guy. But my father's father was more like a yeshiva booker. My father told me he wasn't long for this world as a person. In any case, the point being that the 2 younger brothers went with the grandfather's father, the 2 younger brothers of to Jerusalem and settled as Tzadakah Jews at the time of the Turks in the 1890s, and I knew nothing about it. So the younger brothers were old enough to come to America, but the older brothers were old enough to come to America, but the younger brothers went with the father to Jerusalem, where they then had a family, and they were all involved in the mandate, and they were a known family in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And so I went up and saw him after the 6-Day War. I found my great-grandfather's grave on the Mount of Olives and stuff like that. And I refurbished it, et cetera, because the Arabs had thrown it all down and so on. They all buried on the Mount of Olives looking at the temple. The reason they were looking at the temple, they were waiting for the temple to be rebuilt and so on. That's why they were on the Mount of Olives facing the Temple Mount. That's what Jesus was doing up there too, according, basically. So the temple, Mount of Olives is right opposite the temple. You can see the Temple Mount. In any case, I just want to tell you that my own great-grandfather was one of these Sadaqah Jews in Jerusalem. So that doesn't mean his offspring weren't like that. They were all secularized by that time. They were Orthodox in some ways, but they were all modern people. They really had been affected by the Mandate. They loved the British. They loved British ways. They loved the whole deal. They just liked the modern world, and they were all very modern-looking people. And the father was like, for them, old-fashioned, though they had all. So yeah, I encountered my whole family in Jerusalem when I was just 23 years old, 22, 23, like some of you guys here. And that was really amazing to me. And no one had told me about it previously. Okay, that made for whatever it's worth. So you actually lived through some of these things and you were able to see them. Anyway, this is about my mother being from German Jewish background and Heinrich Heine. Because the reason my father kept it all secret was because of my mother. He was ashamed of it. He didn't, he wasn't willing to talk about it. Yeah, imagine not telling your own children until they're 22 or 23 that your grandfather is in Jerusalem and was buried there, and that you have first cousins in Jerusalem and so on, and the brothers of your father and so on, two of them. I mean, it's just astonishing. So you see how deep-seated these divisions were. If you're really, I see it in my own family. Anyway, so he was born in Bonn. Heine is a perfect example of. I love reading about Heine because it's so familiar to me from my mother's side of my background. Hess was born in Bonn, Germany, and etc. in 1821. And he's obviously an admirer of Spinoza, as we see from his first book, and so on. He's an intellectual sort of person. He didn't think much of his Jewish background at all, an assimilated person. 1848, you may not know, was a big revolutionary year in Europe, a lot of revolts in Hungary and different places, and mostly these were put down in Germany and other places, and the Communist Manifesto was written as a result of that. A lot of people were sentenced to death, and it says here that even Hess was for his participation in those events at that time, and he I'm sure he would have known Karl Marx personally or read him and so on, but he didn't like that approach. And apparently Marx made fun of him, according to this, in the Communist Manifesto. So he's sufficiently intellectual to have been remarked by Marx. In any case, he changed his mind somewhere along the way, and he had a restatement of his thought processes. And suddenly he became a very ardent nationalist, Jewish nationalist. And Rome, Jerusalem, again, 1862, is his statement, his famous statement on the, and this is a very thoughtful essay, so I'll take a little time going through it, okay? I assume you haven't read it, or if you did read it, you read it superficially, so we'll have to go through it bit by bit, and then you'll read it again, and then you'll know it. Okay, my way of return. After 20 years of estrangement, I've returned to my people. So you see, from the 1840s to the 1860s, he was trying the other way. And it's a little bit like Mendelssohn, a little bit like Herzl. And he says, the Jews have lived and labored among the nations for 2,000 years, almost 2,000. But nonetheless, they cannot become rooted organically within them. So he sees the same thing that Herzl will see 30 years later, 35 years later. And he mentions the Damascus blood libel. 20 years ago when the news came to Europe from Damascus of the absurd accusation, the blood libel, using the blood, I don't know if it was Christians or Muslims that encouraged this, you'd have to look into it a bit. But it looks probably like it was from Muslims at this point, but may have been together, because you know, Damascus is not just Muslims, there are Christians in Syria too. You know, that the Jews used non-Jewish children to bake their Passover matzahs with. Once again, we're face to face with the ignorance and credulity. You know, he just dismisses this. This is so pathetic. It's not worthy of that. But you hear this stuff all the time. You know. In fact, this new movie, Borat, whatever it is. You know, I don't think that's really helpful what he does. I don't really like what he does, frankly, but, you know, it's fairly sophisticated, tongue-in-cheek British humor. And, you know, he's a totally Jewish guy, you know, and very proud of his heritage as well. But he impersonates a sort of Muslim or a Muslim journalist or whatever, and he says the most outrageous things about Jews and other people and so on and so forth. And sort of the reason he says it is to have a laugh about the whole thing. It's not serious for him, it's just to have a laugh. You know, he impersonates this journalist from Kazakhstan or someplace, and then he goes and interviews people. You know, he's had a program doing this, and I don't think it's right because he doesn't, a lot of them, he doesn't tell that he's just putting them on, you know, having them on. But of course, apparently it's quite popular. A lot of you guys have gone to the movie this weekend. I see it's the biggest money maker this past weekend. It's probably in his TV thing was very, very popular. But you know, stupid people take that kind of thing seriously. They hear these kind of slogans and they think that, you know, there may be some truth to those things. That, you know, he's just laughing because he's an Oxford type and he's very well educated and he's having a good old time there, putting people on and making fools out of them all. And you're laughing, you probably see what he's talking about, but I'm not sure the average person can really always distinguish between the fact and fiction in these things. And certainly the people he interviews are almost always like taken in totally. And it's frightening, some of the things. I mean, they make total fools of themselves, and it's kind of frightening. I mean, I can't watch it sometimes. It's too awful for me to watch, frankly. But you guys are all laughing, so I see you seem to like it. Anyway, as he says, you know, we're with this ignorance and credulity of the mob, just dismisses of the way Borat is basically doing, of the mobs of Asia and Europe. He's just making a joke out of it all, which are as ready today as they have been in the past 2,000 years to believe any calumny directed against Jews. Okay, this is your Zionist text. I gotta forgive, you must forgive me if these people are interested in the problems that the Jews are facing. I don't mean to keep repeating the same mantra, but this is something that we're going to get here. I was painfully reminded for the first time in many years that I belonged to an unfortunate, maligned, despised, dispersed people, but one that the world has not succeeded in destroying. I like to tell this to Afro-American students in my other class that, you know, they shouldn't be so down on themselves and down on everything. You know, the world has not succeeded in destroying you. You flourished in America 40 million strong. I mean, what are you depressed about? You know, wake up, for God's sakes, you know. See the positive. Stop looking on the negative all the time. I mean, people from Southeast Asia, other areas of the world, they're not always worried about what people think of them or all the negative. They just get on with it, you know. And I try to tell my Afro-Americans, you're in that class, I try to tell them this, but I don't think I succeed. You know, their leadership is really bereft of positive approach. For some reason, they want to accentuate the negative. And they depress everybody, their own groups themselves, and all the whites too. So everyone is totally depressed in the end. When in fact, there's a great success story of the Afro-Americans. Afro-Americans, look, they totally transplanted the native populations in Brazil. There's hardly an Indian left in Brazil. It's all Afro-American. I mean, that's an incredible, I don't say it's success. It's an incredible success story. And the treatment of the Afro-American slaves in Brazil was 10 times worse than any treatment here in the United States. They didn't even want to keep anybody alive. They just want to work them to death. All the southern guys here thought of them as property to try to, you know, benefit from. But then Brazil, bring more and work them to death, bring more and work them to death. It's just a horror story in Brazil. And yet they survived. Basically took over the place, if you want, you know, or the backbone of Brazil today. Anyway. So, but the world has not succeeded in destroying. I think that's a good point. At that time, though, I was still greatly estranged from Judaism. I wanted to cry out in anguish and expression of my Jewish patriotism, but this emotion was immediately superseded by the greater pain which was evoked in me by the suffering of the proletariat in Europe, you know. Look, the proletariat in Europe, that's great, you know. I'm happy the proletariat has got a problem. But let the proletariat take care of itself. The proletariat doesn't need Moses Hess to look out for it. The proletariat has enough strength and power and men, women and people who are suffering in this way to get on with the struggle themselves, and they won't miss Moses Hess, is what, you know, so as he says, you know, and Karl Marx and all these guys, it's the same deal, and Trotsky and all the others. I mean, they feel they need to save the proletariat in Europe. I think the proletariat didn't thank them very much for this, and certainly in Russia, Stalin paid Trotsky back good and proper, and you know, for his supposed concern for the proletariat. And Hess finally decides that, okay, look, you know, there's not a lot that I can really do given my background. I've got to sort out my own people in some manner if I can. So the pure human nature of the Germans is in reality the nature of the pure German race, which he's a bit of a racist here, as you see, but all the Germans have bought this on up to Hitler's time, so he's not far away from the people he's living among, which can rise to the concept of humanity in theory only, but in practice has not yet transcended its innate racial sympathies. Well, there's some truth to that for his time. I think today things have changed quite a bit, hopefully. Not in Eastern Germany, by the way, but in West Germany. German antagonist to our Jewish national aspiration has two sources, reflecting in the Jewish. So he's analyzing the Reformed Jewish thing, why it's not going to be able to succeed here. That's what he's basically starting off. You see, okay, you guys think you're going to be successful in this, you're not. Because the antagonism to these aspirations reflecting the dual nature of man is spiritual and natural. So he's doing rational arguments like Mendelssohn was. I'm going to keep you a little over here, because I wasted some diversions and I need as much time as I can get here. I apologize. I'll keep it till the 20 of. I apologize for that. National aspirations as a whole are contrary to the theoretical internationalism of the Germans. See, the fact that we have these things in our prayer books, they had to get rid of them because it's contrary to the theoretical internationalism of the Germans. However, in addition to this, the Germans opposed Jewish national aspirations because of racial antipathy, which even their noblest spirits have not overcome. The same German whose pure human nature revolted against publishing a book advocating the revival of the Jewish nationality had no objection to publishing books against Jews and Judaism, though the purpose of such works is basically opposed to pure human nature. Anyway, he's arguing about some Germans that he knows and he's arguing with at that time. Further down, progressive German Jews, that's Reformed Jews, seem to think they have sufficient reason for recoiling from any Jewish national expression. You see, here's the start of the recoiling from the recoiling. You know, we've had 40 years of recoiling from any national expression of any kind, and so on. Because of the hatred that surrounds him, this progressive Jew on all sides, the German Jew is determined to cast off all signs of his Jewishness, to deny his race. I think we better hear nationality people, that race has an ugly meaning today. No reform of the Jewish religion, however extreme, is radical enough for the educated German Jews. This is what you're talking to me about, the German Jews, the educated one. The reform for them, you know, nothing is too extreme as such. But you see, even the conversion doesn't relieve them of the German anti-Semitism, and we see that in Wagner's evaluation of people like Mendelssohn. Heine converted too, but then he reconverted. He was ashamed of the fact that he had converted. The Germans hate the religion of the Jews less than they hate their race. They hate the peculiar faith of Jews less than their noses. That's true. You see it in the German writings of these people, you know, that we've read, and Wagner and some of the others. Reform, conversion, education, emancipation, none of these open the gate to German society. the German Jew, hence his desire to deny his racial origins. He quotes a book, Physiological Sketches, tells how the son of a converted Jew, just like Afro-Americans have done in America, used to spend hours every morning at the looking glass, comb in hand, endeavoring to straighten his curly hair, so to give it a more Teutonic appearance. I don't know, I never had any curly hair, so I don't have that problem. You know? I don't know what that problem is all about, frankly. The radical reform movement in Appalachian, which characterized it, see, I don't usually give my background in classes because I don't want people to use it against me. In Appalachian, which characterizes it very well because it puts the axe to the root of Judaism, to the national historic character of its religion. And that's what we've just been talking about. He is aware of all these things and disagrees with it. It has little chance of success, and the tendency of some Jews to deny their racial descent is equally foredoomed to failure. Well, that unfortunately turned out to be prophetic, because 100 years or less than 100 years later, in the 1930s and 40s, we found out what the German program was going to be in those harsh times. As long as he denies his nationality, he lacks the character to acknowledge that he belongs. I mean, it's easy for Hess to say it. It's having suddenly returned, but anyway, he's writing it, and he's a good writer. His false position must become ever more intolerable. What purpose does this deception serve? The nations of Europe have always regarded the existence of Jews in their midst as an anomaly, a peculiarity. We should always remain strangers among these nations. It's true in Europe that's the case. I don't think it's the case in America to that extent, but maybe somewhat. They may even be moved by a sense of humanity and justice to emancipate us, which is happening, obviously, this time, but they will never respect us as long as we make I think basically wherever good is, that's my country, our guiding principle, indeed almost a religion, and forget or place it above our great national memories. So the really dishonorable Jew is not the old pious type, the one who would not let his tongue be cut from his mouth rather than utter a word of denial of his people or nation, but the modern kind, who is ashamed of his nationality because the hand of fate is pressing heavily upon his people. Well, this is sort of like a communist manifesto, but for the Jewish people. There's a lot in here to look at. I'm going to have to speed up here. So, but you get the point. These modern Jews hide in vain behind. So he sees the situation even in 60. He sees the situation, and he sees what's going on. It's interesting that he should be able to see that so clearly when it takes us maybe another 60, 70, 80 years. He talks about what you were asking about, the Messianic age, Christianity here. You can read that here. However, I never believed, and I've never asserted, that Christianity is the ultimate stage of the sacred history of humanity, or that this sacred history found its consummation in Spinoza. You see how important Spinoza was to these people at this time. I still believe this final epoch in universal history first became manifest in the spiritual life of the man with the appearance of Spinoza. Now, I personally haven't even read Spinoza's work all through, and I'm sure most of you haven't either. So I don't even know what he sees in Spinoza that's so new and important. But there's clearly something there, and after you guys have read it, you can tell me, okay? I just don't have time to read everything, and I'll let you read some. It is certain that our present yearning is for redemption, and that's what you ask, a far broader outline than any that Christianity imagined or could have imagined. Well, I'm not sure if that's the case, but he's writing to the Jews after all. And again, the Italians are inspiring them. On the ruins of Christian Rome, regenerated Italian people is arising, what's called the Risorgimento in Italy. And these countries which form the dividing line 123 between Occidental and Orient, namely Russia, Poland, Prussia, Austria, Turkey. You see, one of the problems here again is that these countries already have nationalities. And they're not so mixed as America, so the Jews unfortunately stand out in these countries. Millions of our brethren live there. No more. See how things have changed. Millions of our brethren, there are almost none, except Russia. Because the Russians fought, and therefore Hitler, as far as Hitler got, he exterminated. If he didn't get far enough, he didn't exterminate. So, you know, Stalingrad stopped him. Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, those were the turning points on the Eastern Front. Moscow, if you know the history, 1941, Stalingrad, 42, Kursk, 43. Or maybe, yeah, I think it's 43, 44, Kursk, biggest tank battle in the history of mankind, actually, where the Russians destroyed the German Panzer Corps. Vast battles took place in the Russian theater of operations that make our puny efforts in World War II, in the Western Front anyway, rather secondary. And the big battles were fought in Russia, the big battles that destroyed the German army. We destroyed our share of them with the British, but we were operating against a very weakened German army, much reduced in scope and size. I don't know if you follow those battles, but yeah.
80% of all German soldiers killed were killed by the Russians.
Yeah. I don't know if you follow those battles. They were just immense, weren't they? I mean, Stalingrad was like a meat grinder, and Kursk was huge battle. You know, everyone fought to the death in these battles. There was no quarter given and no quarter asked. There's an incredible struggle, frankly. Anyway, 20 million Russians died, which is, okay, we had 1 million Americans who were killed in the Second World War. That's quite a lot of people, but nothing like 20 million. We wouldn't even be able to imagine what 20 million is. I mean, we're sitting here, I mean, it's not nice, the Iraq struggle. It's probably not been handled and misguided, but we're crying over 2,000 or 3,000, which is kind, it's good. I think it's right to do that, but what would this country do if there were 20 million? I don't think we would even understand what that was like. Anyway, so yeah, those countries are all gone, those communities. And there live millions who pray fervently every day to God of their fathers for the restoration, yeah, in their prayers. They preserve the living kernel. Here's that thing about the living kernel that the Science of Judaism people are talking about, the Reform are throwing out. So he's aware of these arguments between the Reform, the Conservative, and the Science of Judaism people. The sense of Jewish nationality more faithfully than our Western, Occidental's Western. The Western Jew brethren, the Western Jews would breathe new life in the whole of our religion, but they ignore the great hope which created our faith and is preserved through all the tempests of history, the hope of restoration. This is what you're asking about here. I turn to the faithful millions of my brothers and explain, you know, this is the living kernel, and this it will be preserved. The rigid forms of orthodoxy, which were entirely justified before this rebirth century, can become creative again. You know, if Judaism is frozen in place with orthodoxy, you know, we have to let it become creative, like the Science of Judaism school wants it to be. But to be valid, such creativity must come from within, from the living idea of the nationality. You see, he's got it imbued with European nationalism of the mid-19th century. Only a national renaissance, by the way, that national renaissance has not occurred among the Jews. Jews participated in American culture, great Jewish writers. I don't consider Philip Roth a great Jewish writer. I think he's full of self-hatred and shameful, some of the things that he presents as literature. It comes from a town near me. I know the people he grew up with. I knew his cousin. I knew the girl he writes about in Goodbye Columbus. They were from my hometown. I know all about his work, and I think his work is really insulting work. And he's a pathetic person, so I don't consider that part of the Jewish Renaissance. But in any case, there are a lot of Jewish writers like Bernard Malamud and others who have contributed to the American literary scene and so on, and movie making and these different things, the Beatniks, Ginsberg, all these people, Bob Dylan, etc. And, you know, a lot of English, French, German letters, etc. But this Jewish Renaissance that he's talking about has never occurred. Never occurred. I feel that's sad, actually. And one of the things that holds it back is this. The Reform on the one hand, who go whole hog one way, and the Orthodox on the other hand, who strangle. So the living colonel he's talking about never got a chance to live. So anyway, only in a national renaissance can they endow the religious genius of the Jews and so on and so forth. I hope that someday that will happen, but I don't know if it ever will. The Enlighteners, the people who follow the Haskalah, have attempted to open the Jewish scene to the light of modern culture by piercing the hard shell. He understands the problems here, which Rabbinism has armored Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, has given it the shell. None of them, not even the great Mendelssohn, who we've been studying here, could succeed in doing this without destroying the innermost essence of Judaism, its historical national religion, and thus doing a sacred life to death. Well, he's quite elegant in what he says. I'm reading it. I mean, I have nothing to add to this. I'm reading it because I assume that you don't. So these religious reformers, he says that they've happily vanished almost completely. He's wrong. They haven't vanished at all. And as this young lady has remarked, they're pretty much everywhere still. And I don't know where he gets that idea. With their newly invented ceremonies, who's he talking about there? Israel Jacobson and Cece, their newly invented ceremonies. He knows what we've been studying. He is in our mindset of this class. This is the newly invented ceremonies. And what does he say about them? Have sucked the marrow out of Judaism. Yeah, you know, he can really, he's got a good pen. It was not enough for them to, and have left only a shadow skeleton of this most magnificent of all historical forms. Well, you know, he overdoes it, but anyway. It was not enough for them to work toward the development of a Jewish learning on modern scientific lines. We had this, didn't we? We know all about this, don't we? Scientific Judaism, Haskalah, Abraham Geiger. We know all about these people. No, it wasn't enough. And to satisfy the need for orderly and aesthetic form of our ancient religious practice, they cultivated a religious reform that was not in keeping with the spirit of the age. This is all what we've been saying. In other words, they claim zeitgeist. There's no zeitgeist in their thing. The spirit of the age is nationalism, and they're throwing nationalism out the window. It was fashioned in imitation of Christian models and was therefore stillborn. Well, it wasn't, obviously. It's still around and flourishing quite well. It has not the slightest basis either in the general situation of the modern world or the essential national character of Judaism. Well, personally, I would agree with them there, but I don't know what should and does. I haven't got the answer. Because this Renaissance hasn't occurred that he was looking for. I don't deny the validity of the Christian Reformation. You guys find Hess interesting enough that we can continue? I think, if you don't mind, we can go through it. At the time of Luther, nor the Jewish Reform movement at the time of Mendelssohn. The latter, however, see, we know everything what he's talking about. We've already been through this material. The latter, however, was more of an aesthetic than a religious or ideological reform. Luther is talking about. No, Mendelssohn is talking about. These reformers never dreamed of tampering with the historical basis of the religion. But our contemporary reformers propose a reform of this fundamental principle itself. Their reforms have only a negative purpose, if they have any aim, to proclaim unbelief in our nationality as the foundation of the Jewish religion. And one of these reforms only fostered indifference to Judaism and conversions to Christianity. Well, his point ultimately is well taken. That's what did happen. indifference to Judaism was really the, if I could tell you about the people I grew up with, I could tell you that that was certainly true. Conversions to Christianity wasn't happening in America that much, but in Europe that's what was going on. Judaism, like Christianity, would really have to disappear in the face of intellectual progress if it were not more than a dogmatic religion, if it were not a national cult. You see, it can't just be a dogma, it will disappear in the face of progress, which is probably have some truth to that. This is very interesting material, and we don't have time to wrestle with it enough. See, they have so little respect for the essentially national character, and he's right. Judaism is a national character, that's what it is. That they are at great pains to erase every echo and memory of it from their creed and worship. They imagine a recently manufactured prayer book, that's the Berlin prayer book, or a hymnal which contains a philosophical theism put into rhyme and accompanied by music, organs. This is what we've been talking about, and he's just pulverizing it here. This is 1860s, he's already pulverizing it. Is more elevating and soul-stirring than the moving prayers in the Hebrew language and so on. He's really just whacking away at this thing, isn't it? It's quite impressive. This former communist or socialist or whatever you want to call him, gone back to the grassroots, if you want. And he really hates the reformers. You see, the efforts for a German, he doesn't like the rabbis any better though, even though he respects them. The efforts for German Jewish religious reformers were directed toward making Judaism, which is both national and universal, into a second Christianity cut after a rationalistic pattern. Well, I think he's got that all right. This invitation was particularly superfluous at a time when the original itself was already in deep trouble. He said more deal, but deep trouble, I think that's somewhat true. Anyway, this religion of the future, 125, of which some 18th century philosophers are, as well as recent followers, dream, will be neither an imitation of the ancient pagan cult of nature, nor anything like the neo-Christianity we now have, and a neo-Judaism which exists ghost-like only in the minds of our religious reformers. Each nation will have to create its own historical cult. Well, unfortunately, that's what Hitler was trying to do with Wagner. So you see where you get some real weird ideas are perpetrating in the mid-19th century. Each people must become like the Jewish people of God. Anyway, it goes on. Judaism is not threatened like Christianity with the danger from nationalistic and humanistic aspirations of our time. For in reality, the spirit of the age is approaching. You see, the fascism of Germany was a threat to Christianity to some degree. Is approaching ever closer to the essential Jewish emphasis on real life. I do not agree with Mendelssohn that Judaism has no dogmas, and I think he may be right there. It just hasn't been finished. It's always kept on developing, and so on. There are two epics further down that mark the development of Jewish law. The first after the liberation from Egypt, the second after the return from Babylonia. Okay. So one is the Mosaic, and the second is Talmudic. So in the form that we have it, next page, the Torah was handed down to us directly through the men of the second epic. Okay, well, you can read this for yourself. The end of that paragraph, 126. And finally, it is this oral development of the law that Judaism owes its existence. He likes the rabbinic oral law. The supposed also went back to Moses. Upon which the Talmudic material is based, because he thinks that gives the possibility to keep developing. It's not frozen, he thinks. Because you see, this is how we survived the exile for 2,000 years, and this will allow the national regeneration, the fact that it can continue to develop. One last paragraph, I'll let you go. The rabbis were justified in their long struggle against writing down the oral law. Had they kept on teaching and developing the law orally in the schools, Judaism would never have been threatened with the loss of its national legislative genius. In other words, it wouldn't have gotten frozen. It would have kept on moving forward, he thinks. I agree with him to some extent. Writing things down freezes them in place. Keep it oral, keep it moving, it can regenerate itself. Today we have no reason to fear the latter danger. But we can escape the former only if we revive the critical spirit to counteract barren formalism. That is the rabbinic, just knee-jerk observance of what has already been written. If we reawaken in our hearts and souls the holy patriotic spirit of our prophets and sages as an antidote to destructive pure rationalism. He wants poetry, obviously. And of course, Wagner is doing this in operas for the Germans. That's what he's up to. So, you know, he's not too far off from what's happening on the Christian side of things in Germany. Our people must once again steep itself in its history, which has been grossly neglected by the rationalists, and rekindle in the hearts of the younger generation that spirit which was the ultimate source of wisdom and inspiration. This, if you want, Holy Spirit at the bottom. We will then become participators in the Holy Spirit, a kind of zeitgeist, kind of creativity, which alone has the right to develop Jewish law. We fashion it according to the needs of the time and the people. And with the third exile will finally have come to an end, the restoration of the Jewish state will find us ready for it in the right spirit. Well, that's quite a program. I don't think it worked. The Jews weren't ready for anything. They weren't in the right spirit. And we'll see as we progress that that's the case. You guys finish up Hess. Next time we will look at Pinsker and Ben Yehuda. And the time after that, Herzl. And then after that, hopefully, we will look at Nordau, Ahad Am, and Jabotinsky. And maybe if we have time, Brandeis, the American Supreme Court judge. That's what I want you to look at. I'll go through those names again so you know, so you can get ahead. Let me just do a quick before you go here. So we're doing Moses Hess now. So Ben Yehuda is in part 2, and Pinsker in part 2. Part 3, you have Herzl and Nordau. Part 4, you have Ahad Am. And if you want labor Zionism, you could read Aaron David Gord. I don't think we'll have time for that in part 6. And then in part 9, you have Brandeis. And part 10, you have Jabotinsky and Weitzman. And that's what we'll hopefully get to if we're lucky. Bye. I know you want to go. Bye-bye. Sorry to keep you. You guys read Pinsker and Ben Yehuda. Maybe we'll talk more about it. I won't have to read it out loud to you.